There have been countless times in human history where the funnier or frankly much better path hasn't been taken, and one such time when human history continued its streak of disappointing everyone occurred in 1917, when former President Theodore Roosevelt was given permission to raise a small American volunteer force to go to France to fight against Germany on the Western Front in World War I. Now Roosevelt wanted to fight, his men wanted to fight, his French hosts-to-be wanted him to fight, and the US government had just passed a law that near explicitly allowed specifically him to fight. But, as you'll undoubtedly know, Roosevelt never went to war. Which raises the obvious question, why not? Why wasn't Teddy Roosevelt allowed to fight in World War I? So to begin, Theodore Roosevelt wasn't just some random American politician who wanted a scrap. In the 1890s he'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President William McKinley, but when the Spanish-American War broke out he resigned to volunteer to fight. Whilst doing this, he managed to make a public name for himself due to victories at places like San Juan Hill. And after the Spanish had been utterly defeated and surrendered, he returned home a hero and was promptly elected governor of New York. Roosevelt's surging popularity worried McKinley, who didn't want to face any potential challenges, and so he offered to make him vice president. This meant that Roosevelt's popularity would help him in the election, but importantly would give him an essentially meaningless job and would keep him on side and out of trouble. The duo handily won the next election, but McKinley's second term was ultimately cut short due to his assassination. Roosevelt was thus sworn in, and during his presidency he was very popular. However, he promised to only hold office for 2 terms, and so he was followed by William Taft. Despite the two being close friends and political allies, Roosevelt considered Taft to be a weak-willed letdown and so bad at his job that he was actively hurting America. As such, Roosevelt opted to run again in 1912 to get Taft out, and in this election, despite not being a candidate for one of the 2 main parties, he managed to come second. He did manage to cut short Taft's run, well, sit, I guess, as president, but by doing so he split the vote and gave the win to some guy called Woodrow Wilson. As you'll know, when the First World War broke out, Wilson and his fellow Democrats wanted nothing to do with another European war, but did offer to mediate. Wilson wanted the United States to be strictly neutral, maintaining relations and trade with both sides whilst making sure not to insult the other bloc's actions. Because for Wilson, keeping out of the war was his primary foreign policy objective. Roosevelt, however, disagreed with this and was highly critical of Germany's invasion of Belgium and Wilson's lack of condemnation too. Roosevelt believed that sitting out this war would mean that when the dust had settled, the US wouldn't have any say in what the world looked like afterwards. And he believed that the global role of the United States should be that of an outward-looking great power, and so actively joining the Entente made the most sense to him. Now, the US didn't join the Entente until 1917, and during the first years of the Great War, Roosevelt was extremely outspoken. He travelled across the country, often to the largely German-American and Irish-American parts, and spoke out against the German Empire and the Kaiser's imperialism. He also put himself forward as a mediator to end the war because of his past experience with Russia and Japan. And while said experience was perfectly valid, many of the European powers who had previously worked with Roosevelt weren't particularly keen on him. In 1915, the RMS Lusitania, which was carrying hundreds of Americans, was sunk by a German submarine, and this increased US support for the Entente and joining the war. Wilson resisted the rising calls to get involved because whilst more Americans wanted to fight, the majority still favoured neutrality. Also, Wilson believed that the Germans would obviously feel pretty bad about the sinking, and thus would now be much more likely to let him mediate an end to the war, but fun fact, no. After this, Roosevelt went from sometimes making criticisms of Wilson's lack of action to very publicly criticising Wilson's character, and also questioned his patriotism and his ability to run the country. He also stood aside and backed the Republicans against Wilson, hoping to remove him in the 1916 election. But after Wilson won and the Zimmerman telegram came to light, the US's march to war was inevitable. Roosevelt wanted to make amends with Wilson, and so when they met, Teddy offered to back his plan for a draft in return for him being allowed to sign up and fight. Now obviously Roosevelt wasn't a fool. At this point he was 58, often sick, not exactly in the best shape and also blind in one eye. But for him, he believed him going would be a boost to the US and Allied morale, and would, now to be a bit of a downer, give him the opportunity to die in glorious battle instead of succumbing to the numerous diseases he had caught on his previous trip to South America. Roosevelt's request to be the first former president to get machine gunned was met with heavy skepticism, both in the military and the political halls of power, but that wasn't going to stop Theodore from getting his commission. Knowing that the executive was on the fence, he went straight to the legislative. He and his allies gained the support of influential Senator Warren G. Harding, who helped convince his fellow Republicans to support the Selective Service Act, a bill which allowed the government to raise a volunteer force of about 70,000 men, who would go to France alongside the regular army as a vanguard to support the Entente before the rest of the much larger conscripted force could arrive. And this was passed in May 1917, shortly after the US had declared war. Now the act made no mention of Roosevelt whatsoever, but everyone in Congress knew that the men raised were to be led by him to the front lines. And once it was law, Roosevelt and his chosen officers were extremely quick in getting volunteers and making preparations for training. And yet, as you'll know, he never went. So why not? Well, there are numerous good and not so good reasons. The first reason was that no one really knew where Roosevelt, who left the army as a colonel, would sit in the military hierarchy. Yes, he obviously didn't outrank the generals around him, but it would be awkward for them to give an order to a former commander-in-chief, especially a man who was prone to doing what he wanted anyway. And after that, what would they exactly do? Court-martial one of the most popular men in America? That obviously could never happen because it would be terrible for public morale. And morale is also the second reason. Wilson's government knew that Roosevelt's presence would have been a boon to the American mood, and also their allies, with many French military leaders stating that Roosevelt's fame in France and Britain would be a massive boon to their spirits. However, they didn't want to risk him dying, because his death would be damaging to the soldiery's morale and would represent a propaganda victory for the Central Powers. It was suggested as a compromise that he be deployed to France but not to the front lines, which was soon dismissed because good luck telling Roosevelt that he wasn't allowed to do anything. The third reason was that the War Department didn't believe that Roosevelt and his volunteers would be equipped to deal with the horrors of modern warfare. Many there feared that the former president's mindset was stuck in 1898. And the new realities of war would lead to mass casualties and damage to the reputation of the United States military in the eyes of its allies. Now, Roosevelt himself countered this claim and said that he and his volunteers would be trained in dealing with gas attacks and made it clear that the machine gun was something that he'd had great experience with before. The military were also concerned with his physical fitness and believed that sending a withered, sickly old former president to cough himself to death in a French trench didn't serve much of a military purpose. And the fourth and last reason was the main one: President Wilson didn't trust him. Wilson had only just squeaked a victory in 1916 and he was considering running for a third term. And if Roosevelt was deployed, it would only serve to damage these ambitions. If he died, Wilson would be the careless idiot that sent a beloved ex-president to die in a muddy field when he could have been at home. Or if Roosevelt did something incredible, he'd undoubtedly return home a greater hero than he'd left, meaning that the Democrats and Wilson's ambitions would be toast, because he wouldn't be able to compete with that Republican ticket no matter what he did. Wilson was also worried about the perception of the army being divided, between Roosevelt's brave volunteers and the conscripts who were forced to be there, and that division affecting cohesion. And beyond this, whilst Wilson may have liked Teddy from a personal standpoint, that doesn't mean that he'd really forgiven him for the numerous attacks during the lead up to the war. Wilson and his advisors knew that this was something that Roosevelt desperately wanted, and they, feeling spiteful, weren't exactly going to give that to a political opponent. And ultimately, the decision came down to the president, because the act that allowed for the raising of the volunteer divisions was down to his discretion as commander-in-chief. And when Wilson said no, this decision was final, and the now very embittered Roosevelt sought to undermine Wilson for the rest of the war. He criticised the president's conduct and claimed that the US's slow start to the war was his fault, and that Wilson's plans for peace were far too weak, and that peace could only ever be achieved if Germany was broken up. He further decried Wilson's plans for a League of Nations, believing it to ultimately be toothless. Whereas Roosevelt wanted the establishment of a league to enforce peace, in which disputes would go to international arbitration, and if anyone tried to override them with military force, the rest of the great powers would be obliged to intervene against them. This of course wasn't really workable, and basically all of the other great powers thought that the idea was ridiculous, because they were paranoid that the rest of the league would gang up on them to reduce their power. And in 1918, Roosevelt's health took a turn for the worse. And after 2 of his sons were wounded and 1 was killed during the war, he never mentally recovered. Due to the build-up of his previous sicknesses, he died in January 1919, just months after the war had come to an end and without having his chance to serve once more, thereby making history that little bit less interesting, but also meaning that the Entente didn't have to run the risk of trawling through no man's land to find the body of a former president. So all in all, probably for the best. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Sky Chappelle, Katoitska, Gustav Swan, Marvin Kassow, Winston Kaywood, Anthony Beckett, Wyan Hockey, Alex Schwinn, Andy McGeehee, Paul H, Mirza Ahmed, AF Firefly, Coppertone, Yuduan Wang, Shuwenin, L Diamond, Rod D Martin, The McWhopper, Captain Psydog, Spencer Lightfoot, Respectable Level of Chaos, Robert C. Perkins, The Flying Deutschland, Castle Bravo, Kamoon Yoon, Michael Holbert, Rajmahana Panika, Starry Nights, Kalitro, The Jim Stanham, Bonnie Bounds, Jim Strumberg, Remco Huisman, Charles I, Bet Cabot, and Lord Beak.